Welcome once again to Syntax Error, your pretentious philosophical pedantic podcast ostensibly about video gaming and related topics therein. Warning, this podcast contains spoilers, mature content, and language. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello there, welcome back to Syntax Error, Halloween special. I, of course, remain Scott Thurlow, here with Jane Manzer.
And I'm so scared.
And Chris Morgan.
Good evening.
And we're going to continue doing some articles, and this one is called Fight or Flight, The Neuroscience of Survival Horror by, sorry if I mispronounced her name, Maral Tajirian, who is a neuroscientist of Thwack Consulting, and she sort of delves into somewhat of the mechanisms and some of the psychology and so forth behind survival horror games, which are some of my favorite games. So, I basically have three sort of main prongs, I guess, I want to bring up in this article, that one of which is, she sort of does a broad overview of, like, the survival horror games in general, and like the pitfalls of trying to make such a game, trying to make it effective and so forth, which we've discussed previously on Syntax. But because of her background being a neuroscientist, I thought there are two interesting things, and one of which is the phenomenon of priming, which I'm going to pass off to E to explain and as applied to horror games.
Well, aside from another aspect that we'll bring up later, mirror neurons, I thought this was perhaps the most interesting part, and I don't know how much it deals with obviously it deals with neuroscience.
To some extent, we shall say.
Specifically, her application to it. But the idea of you need to have sort of signifiers within a game or any horror that will, in a sense, establish a code within a person in order to signify when, like, an uncanniness or a horror event is approaching.
About to happen, yes.
So one of the great examples of that, not in game, in games too, but like in horror in general, is like a music associated with a certain villain. I think
or an
Jason
enemy
Voorhees
or whatever,
has he's approaching when that music strikes, and it triggers something in your brain, informing you that you have previously established that there's a fear associated with this trigger, and when the trigger happens, you react to it. And I think it's such a neat idea, and something, if I ever do create a game or a film or something like that, I'd like to play with that concept.
Going to exploit that?
Well, it's such a fascinating methodology to use.
Sure.
So. I was trying to think of some examples, and the one that comes to mind is,
she throws in a couple, but
yeah. I was thinking in terms of like Alien Isolation and Dead Space, and I know like when they did Dead Space, it was one of the first games where they, to create that, the ambient, how the noise was, was really important to it to kind of immerse you. But then I always think
it serves as a cue, essentially.
Right. And then I think, like, in terms of Alien Isolation, where it's first person, and the one thing that you always want to listen for is to hear if he's rattling around the air vents.
Yep.
The alien.
That was really good sound design, yeah. And you're right. It's a priming factor.
It is totally a priming factor. So, because I remember so many times when I'm about to leave my hiding, and then I hear,
Yeah.
And there weren't like musical cues, so to speak, but there were definitely things you were listening for. And I agree with Ian. I mean, that to me, and I think we've probably discussed this before, is, the importance of like something like sound design, and that would be something I would want to explore, in one of our movies or.
Sure. It doesn't even have to be sound design, that's very important. But it's also can be visual cues as well.
Well, I think she talked about lighting in one point.
But
it could be any of them.
But color schemes can signify prime people for certain things. Any kind of sensation that you can, like, obviously smells and touch is not available, but like, I guess auditory and visual, sure. As of right now, is what is important for establishing these priming.
No, that's absolutely true. And like, I found it interesting that, yes, all of that. And I guess I wouldn't have thought about that effect as applied to games, at least one of the major things, but it seems sort of obvious and certainly applied to horror games in general. But she does point out that for example, like she does use examples from Dead Space variously because of one of the games she's sort of like filtering it through, and Silent Hill 2. That's Silent Hill TOO, that is, the series as a whole. But for example, when the world turns the dark world or whatever it is, like that's sort of a priming event too. And conversely, she writes, I have this one picked out, is that events that lead the player through a relatively safe part of level may lower the guard to new threats when revisiting the same environment, which I thought was pretty good. And on top of that, these choices often save time in level design. So it's like sort of like, without negative context, a cheap way to, keep your level design like down to a minimum, but use it effectively to prime players for an event, this and that sort of event.
What I was thinking about, one of my favorite primes, and I don't know why I didn't think this earlier, is the Left 4 Dead series, The Witch.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's a good one.
You hear the crying first, and then, everything builds, like the music as you get closer to it. It's kind of like a little Geiger counter. That's probably my favorite primer.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I don't know if it was in the priming or in a different section she was talking about, but it was the overuse of it diminishes. So I think she was talking about Shattered Memories.
Silent Hill. She was, yeah.
Where, like, because you frequented it, like, it lost the impact.
Yeah, so, like, that's going to be true broadly of almost anything, as you said earlier, but I certainly think it stands here that, yeah, when you encounter one, like, instance of something, it's going to be effective, but if they overuse that, or you see it a number of times, it's less and less, the tension drains out of it, more or less. And as we know, repetition is sort of the death of horror, as we've discussed in the previous Syntax horror specials. But I still think it's, you can use it, as long as you, as you said, don't overuse it, or perhaps switch it up, like subvert it here and there, and that will remain effective throughout. So the next sort of big pillar I want to talk about is, Ian just sort of alluded to it earlier, is the mirror neurons effect, which is something from neuroscience itself. It's an effect that's in play, like in real life, obviously, where you see, like, your brain will sort of empathize, in a sense, to actions that you see performed by others. You sort of put yourself in their place. And I think she points out that this effect is important, in fact, to empathy itself as a whole. But as applied to games, for example, an example from Silent Hill that she uses is that when James sticks his hand into a toilet, like, your brain, you sort of almost like feel that, like, have that experience. So it's effective. So, like, when you're seeing other things like that in other games, it can be used to heighten the sensation and the immersion of the game.
And establishing empathy with a protagonist is incredibly important for the horror genre.
Yep.
And I can think of so many horror movies and games too that I feel nothing for the characters. And so I don't even know if you need to, like, always do the mirror neuron thing. If a character can make you laugh and you...
Sure. If you identify with it, with them.
Or, like, I could go for a beer with this guy. I would be sorry if this fictional character died. Yeah. That's more not that I want these people to die.
Sure, so, like, it's a broad thing. Like, it can, like, when a game uses it well, when devs realize that effect exists and can integrate it into a story or a game or, like, a scene, then, yeah, if it's done well, it's going to affect you as a player, and you're going to, again, sort of heighten the experience and get more out of it, rather than just being like, okay, like, sort of bland, like, I'm bored by this, and I don't feel anything at all because they mishandled it, or just wasn't, like, working, it wasn't all clicking together. Got anything, Chris?
Yeah, actually,
What do your mirror neurons say?
Well, this is an interesting topic, especially how it relates to, when Ian was talking, I did get distracted because I finally, no.
His own mirror neurons were firing.
My mirror neurons were firing. Mm-hmm. But when Ian was talking, I remembered that for the first time, I saw the first ad I had seen for Evil Within 2. And I was like, oh, I can't wait to, looking forward to this. And it's just like, dad loses child again. I'm like, oh, God, I don't really care. And I don't think it's just because I don't have kids. It's just like that is just so overdrawn. And I know she talks about desensitization later and things that resensitize you. It's one of those things where, like, there are certain tropes that you could do well and certain tropes you can't. Like Dead Space, you have, Isaac looking for his girlfriend. And I thought that was done. That's an easy trope to go into, and that's done well. The children trope, Red Dead out of the horror genre did that well. But like you get something like Alien Isolation, you're looking for another family member that's her mom. But the thing is, once something becomes all encompassing, it's just like I start tuning it out. So
Sure.
I think having a well-rounded protagonist is I think the art of taking something that's a trope and trying to
exploit the mirror neuron effect.
Exploit it without
I get what you're saying.
without to the point where it's just like, okay, this is cliche, and you just shut your brain off.
Well, you're right about because there's a concept of cheap actions to provoke empathy.
Yes,
and and people who are not talented writers, whether you're dealing with movies or video games, will have these moments in there as, in a sense, priming you to, this is a moment you're going to have empathy for this character.
Yeah, you must feel empathy now.
But unlike horror, which is a more primal, I think, more primal instinct than,
if not like, the most primal instinct,
empathy
she mentioned here.
I feel that you can you can be easily tricked into being scared. Or I'll actually give it how the jump scares a cheap trick to get you to be scared of something. Having that, oh, you lost a child, is the emotional equivalent of a jump scare.
Yeah.
For empathy.
Yeah, and the other,
it's a cheap MacGuffin.
The other part, the other one is losing, like, wife, girlfriend, husband, etc.
Insert significant other.
Yeah.
Family.
Which, again, if that's done well, like in Dead Space, it was kind of like, okay, you kind of forgot about her after a while. Honestly, because she was really just a plot device, and fine, keep her there.
Sure.
But then you talk about, like, Ripley's daughter looking for her in Alien Isolation. And even though it was like a survival game and it was really good horror simulator, you did get a sense that this woman was looking for her mom, but trying to put all the pieces together. So there was that level of it. And, and to be honest with you, like you said, if you've got an immersive game, and I haven't played Res Evo 4, it sounds like that. That might be part of the case, is like, you get yourself, your car breaks down in a lonely road. I remember like when I was going on the beach one time, going through the Pinelands, like after midnight, by myself, overtired.
And
I'm
saw
like thinking,
Pyramid Head himself.
the last thing I want to do is get caught here. So like, if you were to have a video game where it could provoke that kind of visceral reaction from something you commonly do, I really don't think you really need a motive beyond that to start the road going.
So I'm going to jump in here with perhaps the best horror game I played recently, which is Resident Evil 7.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's been long enough that I can spoil things.
It's fine. It's been almost a year. Yeah. Sure.
You have to... So they start off with a fairly standard, you lost a loved one and you're going to find them. And then they quickly turn it on the head with you having to kill them.
Yeah, you find her pretty quickly, and then it becomes a boss battle, and it's awesome. Trust me.
It's very emotional because they do enough to establish your relationship and with tricking you with the empathy, but then that twist is such a like a knife in the side there. And also you having to chop off your own hand right at the beginning too.
Yeah.
Is like the way Resident Evil 7 functions is they do first person, but they make it so it feels like you are visually, like the actions seem very natural. So it adds that, like, I think she goes in that camera angles are very important for building that
I was going to mention that quickly, but yeah, you're definitely right about that.
And I think that this, like Resident Evil 7, I was very sympathetic with the faceless protagonist of that game.
Sure.
I haven't played Resident Evil 7 yet, but I've heard...
I thought you were going to say something about that.
No. I don't really have much to add because I pretty much said most of what I could for an hour, talk about...
But that is a good segue, though. I will bring up something that perhaps you both can address. Is the final sort of thing I wanted to explore that she mentions, is that because of that, yes, when a game is able, and a story is able to achieve that and use those two sort of phenomenon and some other just solid design and writing and so forth, it's going to be effective. However, that's sort of few and far between, which is something we said previously. So the trap that many fall into, Resident Evil is guilty of it as a series, and so is Dead Space, is that it's easier to make an action-adventure game and slap on like a horror, mask, if you will, a skin onto it, because you don't have to keep up the tension. You don't have to keep, subverting the expected jump scares and so forth. You can just have action the whole time, like, oh yeah, I'm fighting aliens or whatever, and zombies.
And I think you brought up with Resident Evil 7 that it's a shorter game. And I think
that is true as well.
Beth and I saw like a trio of really good horror movies that weren't action films that didn't require jump scares. And they were all like 90 minutes or less.
Sure, it's hard to keep it up.
Yeah. But the thing is, only make a game as long as you can keep that up. Don't give us a lot of unnecessary minutia. Don't devolve into an action game just because you have to, because that's a different kind of padding. Keep your story succinct. And if you've got to make a 10-hour game as opposed to like, a 40-hour game, but that 10 hours or 20 hours is amazing, then do that.
2 points here. One is I've actually played a lot of horror games that eventually they become action games.
Yeah, devolve into it, or just degenerate, we'll say.
Here's the thing is, I don't necessarily have anything against action games particularly. It's just that there's a level of helplessness that is required in horror. There's also a level of achievement in gameplay that eventually you have to become overcome the thing that's
or somewhat overpower some of the
But when you become overpowered, it becomes an action game. I actually think, I didn't finish it, but Alien Isolation supposedly did that very well, which you eventually can fight off the alien.
It's hard as shit, but you still can. You have something versus nothing, I guess I'll say.
Yeah.
But but this is a film thing too. Look at Alien and Terminator. Both started off as horror games, and the movies, and the sequels were action.
Sure, at least more actiony. I mean, you're right, and like. Again, it's something we said, and I don't know how to solve it. I'm not going to solve it right now, but just be aware that it is difficult to keep up that sort of true horror atmosphere, mood, setting, etc. game, even other mediums. But when you can, but I think one of the factors is, of course, length. If it's not repetitive, if it's not overdone too much, then it will be effective if it's balanced enough and it stops. Before it overstays its welcome, I guess, or before, again, becomes stale.
And I think she said it here best, and I agree, this applies to movies too, because, action movies are kind of boring unless they're done beautifully like Mad Max, they're pretty boring. But she said at some point, when you decrease the anxiety, when you turn it into something like, a first-person shooter, it desensitizes you to violence. But by doing that, by keeping the anxiety up, it actually increases your sensitivity.
You're sensitized to it.
Yeah, it sensitizes you to it. And I think that's really important when you're talking a horror game, is you want to be sensitized. You really want to viscerally be a part of that, because if it loses you, then you're basically walking through a cheap haunted house and you're not really scared.
Yeah, true.
As opposed to being that, going back to that little kid where all of a sudden it's just like you're walking through a dark hallway and you don't know, don't see, can't hear what's coming up ahead.
Yeah, that's the thing. And sort of a sub thing for that you just mentioned that I have picked out real quickly is that when you have like scripted scenes that are supposed to be scary, again, they can be effective, but the issue is that I thought was well said, that also then breaks you out. It reminds you of the linearity of a game that breaks you out of like emerging and of a personalized experience. You're like, oh, everyone's who plays this game is going to like the dog breaking through the window is a famous thing from the original Resident Evil, or maybe 2. Like
Resident Evil 2 was the crows breaking through the
but like that always happens in a sense, but it's scripted, so it's always there. Which again, I'll plug and praise for Resident Evil 7 that they're able to achieve organic moments. So not every player experiences the same oh shit moment at the same fucking time every single playthrough. So I think they elevated it to an extent, and at least in that game. And Alien sort of is like that as well. And Dead Space did have its moments similar to it.
They actually show one of the examples is a scripted movement from Dead Space.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I mean, like again, as we've said, it's just interesting that after we've discussed a number of elements and what makes good effective horror and what pitfalls they can fall into, that viewed through the lens of neuroscience, at least to an extent, I think are quite interesting. And so yeah, check out more things about mirror neurons for sure, and maybe be aware of these effects when you're playing your horror games, that you can look out for if they're doing it well, if they're like using these these phenomenon or these angles well, or if like, oh, they missed a huge opportunity there, it would have been great if they did this, but they just we're lazy about it.
I can't think of an example from a game, but, kind of branching off slightly from what you guys are talking about. We saw a movie last night, and it was called The Innkeepers, and there was one point where you saw something, and it was, even though you knew it was there was a point where it still made you jump.
Sure.
And to me, that is like, jump scares are easy, but to actually say like, here's the thing, it's right next to you, or whatever.
The story. Yeah, I remember what it is. Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it's whatever's revealed, and it makes you jump, and it's not like a jump scare, but all of a sudden, it kind of like something's coming, you don't know when, and it's kind of like and they do set up early in the film. But what I'm saying is, when a video game can actually do that, even if it's a timed event, it goes back to the anxiety and the anticipation, and the longer you can keep that going, not just having crows or whatever fly through the window,
yeah.
but the longer you can see, something's there. You don't know when it's going to rear its head. I think Alien Isolation to a certain degree played with that. Probably not so much Dead Space. I really wish I could have a couple more things come to.
All right. I'll tell you my story. Just reminded me. So I got scared by the same area in Resident Evil 4, like twice in a row, 1 year after another. Like I played it 1 year and I played it again. Like I basically played Resident Evil 4 mostly every Halloween or for a while. So I'll probably do it again this Halloween. But here's my anecdote. It was the maze area, if anyone's familiar, the maze of the castle. So they do a great job of, what happens is if there's any enemies alive, you can hear them moaning, but you don't know like where it's coming from. It's just, if it's silence, you're kind of safe. So I was going through the maze, and because it's a fucking hedge maze, I was like, I know motherfuckers like around here. Like he's somewhere through one of them. I let my guard down for a second. Like I came to him like, I don't think he's going to be here. I just got distracted by a split second, came around, motherfucker was right in my face. Right there, right? The same thing happened a year later, just in a different spot of the maze. And like the thing is, I almost psyched myself out. I'm like, man, this happened to me last year. This time it's definitely not. And like, I checked the spot because of the priming thing, sort of. I checked the spot where I checked him the year before. It wasn't that. So I was like, all right. And again, let my guard down for a second, and boom, there he was. They got me twice. Not scripted. He's just the last enemy there that I didn't clear out before. And again, that's why I think Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest ones, because it's able to do that. It has moments in it that aren't the same. Like someone else could play that same section of the maze and be totally fine, or not even have that at all. So again, just remember that when done well, it could be very effective, even if you played the game numerous times by that point. So I'm going to leave off. The final thing is that, of course, something I agree with. She writes it's very general, but I think it's a positive thing. The next step is about horror and survival horror in general, that the industry needs to be bold to experiment with new genres. It might be risky, but it is much needed in an industry that boasts literally hundreds of games that follow the exact same recipe, and that I very much agree with. We should have some more experimentation. Shake up the formula when and if you can, because as she writes again, it is clearly evident that the era of one-size-fits-all games is long gone, which I think is quite true. Mm-hmm. So, like we said, we sort of mentioned the games that we thought recently-ish that did it well, and perhaps are, if not pushing the envelope, at least finding ways to keep it fresh, which I hope continues throughout, and hopefully we'll see some more horror games maybe coming out this year and early next year. So, anyone else got anything else to add?
No.
All right. Well, this has been Syntax Error. We've been discussing the neuroscience of survival horror, and hopefully you've learned something or found something interesting. I, of course, have been Scott Thurlow, here with Jane Menzer.
My life would make an interesting survival horror.
I think it would. And Chris Morgan.
Good night.
We'll see you next time.
Editing and engineering by Scott Thurlow. Music by Stephen Hermosi. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.